Good morning, everyone. It is Pastor Monica McDougall here, pastor of Attica First United Methodist Church, and it is a joy to be with you all this morning, Sunday, September 17th. My sermon this morning is titled Family Reunion, and it is inspired by a passage from the book of Genesis, chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. This morning, I will be reading this passage from the Common English Translation. So join me as we prepare our hearts and minds for worship this morning as we hear these words from the book of Genesis. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants, so he declared, "Everyone leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all of Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me. You will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last another 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I'm speaking to you. Tell my father about my power here in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed all of his brothers and wept, embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. So every June when I was growing up, my family would load up in my grandparents' van with serving dishes full of casseroles and mayonnaise-based sides, and we'd make the 7-mile-long journey from our family's farm to Lane, Kansas for the annual Ellis family reunion. To be honest with you, I wasn't a huge fan of attending these family reunions. Sure, the food was always delicious, but it just wasn't a ton of fun for a kid. My brother and I were often the only children in attendance, and we were always subject to a never-ending barrage of questions about our lives from our older relatives. Every year at this gathering, I basically became my mom's shadow. I'd find her and stay as close to her as possible until after the meal was over, when she would give my brother and I the all clear that we were allowed to leave. When we were in elementary school and middle school, we'd walk to a nearby playground and play until my parents were done. And then once we got our driver's licenses, we'd insist on driving separately. And as soon as we could, we would go back home. For several years, I tried to get out of going altogether, but I was never successful. I remember as a teen telling my parents just how little I enjoyed the gathering, and I asked them why I even needed to be there. They explained to me that it was important to my grandma. So if my grandma was going to be there, I needed to be. But after nearly 2 decades worth of family reunions, I started to notice some interesting dynamics. I mean, after all, there wasn't much for me to do but to look around and observe. And what I learned was my family was complicated. Most families are, if not all families are. I don't need to remind you all of that. You are aware of that reality in your own unique way based on your own unique family. At my family's reunions in Lane every summer, the complicated nature of my grandma's extended family was always on full display. Even as a child, I could sense that along with all of the pleasantries and jovial conversation, that there was still some sort of undercurrent of tension that was rarely directly brought forth, but always kind of simmering in the background. Now, don't get me wrong, Ellis family reunions were never knockout, drag down fights. No one was yelling at each other, but the tension was still there. It would usually show up in mumbled insults, subtle eye rolls, and vague digs at members of the family or people no longer with us. And over the years, I was able to learn some of the stories behind this tension from my dad and my grandmother, other members. They would tell me about some of the things that had happened in our family's history that led to this dynamic. And with each new story I learned, I kind of became more frustrated with my family. Some of the events in question were decades old. Some were even experienced by members of the family who were no longer living. So why then, I would wonder, are we still upset about them? Why are we still holding grudges against one another? If the people who had had the initial fight that we're talking about died in the 1960s, why are we still talking about it in the 2010s? Why are we fighting someone else's battle? Why are we repeating the mistakes of our ancestors, letting trivial disagreements continue to hammer wedges into the family so many years later? These were the questions that I would find myself asking each and every year. And they're also kind of the same questions I find myself asking when I read our Bible, particularly the book of Genesis. From Adam and Eve's fall from paradise to the death of Joseph, the book of Genesis tells the ancient story of the nation of Israel. As we've discussed in the past, the word Genesis translates to "in the beginning," a reference to the book's famous opening line. Genesis is an account of the creation of the world, the early history of humanity, and of Israel's ancestors and the origins of the Jewish people. Throughout this book, we meet several patriarchs. These patriarchs begin with, of course, the first man, Adam. Through Adam's line, we get to his third son, Seth. From Seth, we get to Noah. From Noah, we eventually get to Father Abraham. And of course, Abraham is the father of Isaac. Isaac is the father of Jacob. And Jacob is the father of the 12 sons that make up the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Israel, Israel being Jacob's new name that he takes on later in his life, have different mothers. Several of the sons are the sons of Leah. There are 4 sons who are the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, who are 2 of Jacob's concubines or second wives. And then, of course, Joseph and Benjamin are the sons of Rachel. Now, at my family's reunion, someone would bring this book, a Bible that we called the Family Bible. It's a large, literal Christian Bible, but it has a record section in it where you would write down dates of births, deaths, marriages, things like that. This was especially important back in the day when there wasn't a record like that widely available. For some people, it would have been the only evidence that they ever existed, right? But within this book, we would tuck in stories, handwritten notes, pictures. It was sort of like a diary and a scrapbook and a Bible all combined into one. Now, I like to think that the book of Genesis sort of functioned in this same way for the nation of Israel. It's a collection of their family's history. And when you read that history, you discover that families really have always been complicated, even in the ancient world. If I thought my family's history was filled with drama and intrigue, well, we really have nothing on Israel. To show you exactly what I mean by this, here's a quick summary of some of the major plot points in the book of Genesis. First, Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden, where they and their descendants must labor for the rest of their earthly lives. Then Adam and Eve's eldest son, Cain, murders his brother Abel. Then Adam and Eve's descendants are said to become wicked and obsessed with evil. So God decides to flood the earth, but spares the family of Noah. There's conflict then between Noah and some of his sons. They become estranged. Some of the sons get disowned. The descendants of Noah repeat the same cycle of wickedness and get punished again through the famous story of the Tower of Babel. Eventually went to Abraham and his wife Sarah. Abraham and Sarah struggle to conceive of a child on their own, and so Sarah starts to question God and God's plan for them and orders Abraham to take on a second wife. So Abraham does just that. He takes on another wife. He has a concubine, and with that concubine, a woman named Hagar, he has a son named Ishmael. But unfortunately, Sarah and Hagar do not get along. And so Sarah is abusive towards Hagar, and Hagar runs away. And after this, Abraham essentially abandons her and her son. Abraham then nearly kills his other son that he eventually has with Sarah, his son Isaac, in an attempted sacrifice before God luckily intervenes and stops it. Isaac marries and has two rival twins, Esau and Jacob, openly favoring his younger son Jacob. Jacob, in cahoots with his mother Rebekah, tricks his ailing father Isaac into giving Jacob the birthright that Esau is entitled to as the oldest son. Esau is furious over the loss of his birthright and wants to kill Jacob, so Jacob is forced to run away. Jacob then meets a man. He wants to marry that man's youngest daughter, but his father-in-law tricks him into marrying the older sister first before he can marry the younger sister. And then after Jacob marries both of these sisters, he openly favors Rachel and her son Joseph over Leah and her sons, which leads to intense jealousy between Joseph and his brothers. And because of that jealousy, the brothers are so consumed with their hatred for their brother and everything he represents that they sell him into slavery. Whew, right? That is a lot. That is a lot of drama, a lot of twists and turns, ups and downs. And when we pay close attention to these stories, we see quite a few patterns emerge here, right? There are multiple instances of sibling rivalry, of family estrangement and abandonment, of trickery and deception, of lies. Generation after generation of Israel's family is engaging in this same sinful behavior, all culminating in this betrayal of Joseph when he's sold into slavery. And our gospel passage this morning kind of jumps over Joseph's life in Egypt and takes us to the moment in which Joseph finally reunites with the brothers who betrayed him. But let's review just a little bit of Joseph's story. Decades before, blinded by jealousy, Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph spends many years toiling in bondage, hundreds of miles away from home, living with the reality of what his brothers, his own flesh and blood, did to him. Eventually, he works his way up the ladder, becoming a household servant to a man considered elite within Egyptian society. But the wife of this master propositions Joseph, and when Joseph denies her, she falsely accuses him of assault, and he's thrown into prison. Eventually, though, Joseph's gift for interpreting dreams, the very gift that contributed to so much of his brother's jealousy and hatred towards him, is what helps him achieve his freedom from prison. He uses this gift to become an important aid to Pharaoh, helping Pharaoh navigate a devastating famine. Then one day, when Joseph is least expecting it, he looks up, and who does he see standing in front of him in Egypt? He sees Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. He sees Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, and Naphtali. He sees his brothers, his betrayers. And as if that isn't bad enough for Joseph, his brothers don't even recognize him. After all, he's no longer the scrawny and weak teenager that they sold into slavery. He's a man now, a powerful, strong man. And Joseph's initial reactions upon seeing his brother is one of pure, unadulterated anger. And I can't say that I blame him, because his brothers arrive in Egypt to collect grain during the famine. But Joseph can tell that they don't recognize him. So he kind of takes advantage of that, right? And he deals with them harshly. He asks them about their family, and they tell Joseph that they have a younger brother who is back home. And Joseph thinks that they're lying to him, that they're pretending that their younger brother Joseph is still alive back home. And so Joseph accuses them of lying. He accuses them of spying. And he imprisons one of the brothers, Simeon, and orders that the rest of them go home and bring back their youngest brother. And by doing this, they will prove that he exists. And then and only then will Joseph allow Simeon to be released. But we know, of course, that the brothers weren't lying. They did have a younger brother back home in Canaan. Joseph's mother, Rachel, had given birth to another son, after Joseph had disappeared. Now, Rachel had passed away at this point, but Benjamin was back home with their father, Jacob. The brothers return to Egypt. They bring Benjamin with them. And now Joseph becomes the brother who is blinded by jealousy and rage because he sees Benjamin being cared for and loved by his brothers. I'm sure he thought to himself, where was this love and this care for me when I was the little brother who needed you to take care of me and protect me? And you didn't. You sold me into slavery. You abandoned me. So Joseph frames Benjamin for theft and threatens to punish him. But then, one by one, each of his brothers volunteers to take Benjamin's place. They beg Joseph to let Benjamin return to his father in Canaan. They say that their father simply can't lose another son. He already lost one beloved younger son. He can't lose another. And that is when Joseph loses it. He weeps. He reveals his identity. He forgives his brothers. He tells them to go home to retrieve their father and then to come live with him in Egypt. And then he embraces them. It's a complete 180 to that first reaction of anger. Now, typically when I've heard this passage preached on, the main take is that this is a story of forgiveness. Now, that is not incorrect. It absolutely is. But I think it's even more than that. I think that this is first and foremost a story of knowing when enough is enough. Each and every generation of Israel has replicated the same exact patterns of behavior. Cain murders Abel. Noah disowns his sons. Abraham abandons Ishmael. Jacob betrays Esau. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. Each new generation of men fails to learn from the mistakes of their fathers and their fathers' fathers. And we get why, right? I minored in psychology in college, so I took many classes in developmental and adolescent psychology. And the one thing you learn about the development of children is just how profound of an impact our parents and guardians have on who we grow to become. We spend our earliest, most formative years looking to and learning from the adults in our lives who take care of us. And we know that this can have really positive impacts and really negative impacts, right? Kids who witness violence in their homes are statistically much more likely to commit acts of violence when they grow up. And kids who grow up around addiction are statistically much more likely to become addicts themselves. Of course, kids who experience abandonment or abuse are more likely to both perpetrate further abuse as they grow up, but also to continue to be victims of abuse. In psychology, this phenomenon is known as intergenerational trauma. Joseph's initial impulse upon seeing his brothers is to enact revenge. Now, you might be familiar with the phrase, hurt people, right? I think that's true. It's certainly true here because at first, all Joseph wants to do is make sure that his brothers feel the same pain and fear that he felt. He wants them to suffer the way he suffered. It's a pretty human response, one that I'm sure many of us has had when we come face to face with people who've harmed us. We want them to feel the pain and the hurt that we felt. But eventually Joseph does this really bold thing. He says enough is enough. Not literally, of course, but through his actions. He chooses to do the much harder, much braver thing here. He chooses to do better, to be better than the men who came before him. Now, don't get me wrong here. I don't want the takeaway from this sermon to be for you to think that if someone has abused you or mistreated you, that you just need to let it go, move on, be in relationship with them. If someone is an unsafe person, you are never obligated to spend time in their presence. You have to take care of yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You aren't even obligated to be in contact with that person at all if you don't have to. But what is so life-giving about Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers in this story is that he allows himself to see their remorse and to be moved by their repentance. Because Joseph's brothers have changed. They have acknowledged their sins. They have spent every moment of their lives after they sold Joseph reckoning with the harm that they caused both to Joseph and to their entire family. They learned from their mistakes, and as evidenced by how they treated and how they fought for Benjamin, they were now loving a younger brother in the way that they should have loved Joseph. And while none of that undoes the pain and the suffering that they inflicted upon Joseph, Joseph chooses forgiveness anyway. We, as the reader, are reminded through Joseph's story that we can choose forgiveness. We can choose to stop cycles of violence, cycles of resentment and hate. Joseph's story is ripe with important lessons for each and every one of us. From the perspective of each character in this story, there is so much to learn. One of my favorite biblical scholars and authors, Dr. Will Gaffney, once wrote of the lessons within this story by saying, excuse me, remembering Joseph, telling his story means remembering that some family relationships are deeply troubled, even violent. Remembering Joseph means reminding ourselves that even in the most deeply troubled family that has experienced unimaginable rupture, that forgiveness and healing are possible. Remembering Joseph and telling his story through this lesson provides an opportunity to reflect on our stewardship, generosity, and relationships with others, neighbors, and strangers. And lastly, today's lesson, with its focus on Joseph, reminds us that our actions have consequences that we may not be able to foresee. Lots of lessons here, right? Joseph was able to do what his brothers, his father, his grandfather, and so many other of his ancestors failed to do. He chose to love instead of hate. He chose to let go instead of holding on. He chose to forgive instead of condemn. As long as blood continues to flow through our veins, as long as we continue to breathe in and out, as long as we continue to be alive, then it is never too late to stop those cycles of hate and resentment and trauma. But how? How do we do this? Well, when we look at Joseph's story, we learn that it takes time, self-reflection, and humility. Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers is forged over decades. If he had encountered his brothers in the first few years of his captivity in Egypt, the wound would have still been too raw, right? He likely would have leaned into that initial impulse to seek revenge. Instead, because he had time to process his experience, to let himself feel it, to figure out all the emotions that are present behind it, he was able to handle it differently. Multiple times in Joseph's story, we are told that he takes time to weep. Joseph lets himself sit in the hurt to feel it fully. Whereas our impulse as humans is often to avoid pain at all costs, to ignore emotions that we deem as negative. Emotions like sadness, anger, and disappointment. This is something known as toxic positivity. Failing to allow yourself time and space to hurt often leads to really unhealthy expressions of emotion. Again, hurt people, right? So allowing ourselves to feel and to grieve and to weep, like Joseph did, helps us to heal so that we are able to let go of resentment and not to operate out of open wounds. And of course, Joseph allowed himself to be humbled. Over the many years that Joseph was in Egypt, he had worked himself up into a person who held tremendous power. Far more power than his brothers ever had. So the script really flips here, right? Because his brothers had enough power to sell him into slavery. There was more than, he was outnumbered. They were stronger than him, older than him. They had more information than him. But now he's the one with all the power, right? And that power could have been used to make his brothers suffer and suffer greatly. More greater than Joseph had even suffered. But instead, Joseph decided to use that power to care for his family. Instead of taking an eye for an eye approach to justice, Joseph decides to love his brothers the way he wanted to be loved, the golden rule, right? In that way, he embodies the type of healthy, loving family that God always intended for us humans to have. My friend, Joseph's story invites us to imagine a world where families are not sources of trauma and pain. This story shows us what is possible when we choose to do and be better than generations before. Joseph's brothers acknowledged their sin and put their repentance into action, reminding us that there's power in admitting when we've made mistakes, when we've caused harm, to say we're sorry, to do what we can to try to repair what we have broken. Joseph chooses to surrender his desire for revenge, reminding us that we don't have to hold on to that which doesn't serve us. Together, this family reunion between these brothers reminds us that it is never too late to try and repair that which has been broken, to try to change the script, the narrative of a family. We are deeply flawed, imperfect people who are capable of causing tremendous pain. But God empowers us to move ever on towards perfection. When we choose to worship God and not ourselves, when we choose to seek God's will and not our own, we can reunite that which has been divided. Amen.